Please take your seats now and join me in welcoming Director of the Institute of Politics, Mark D. Gearan.
Thank you. Thank you, Brinkley. Also, thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you, Brinkley, for those nice guiding words, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. We have a very interesting Friday afternoon conversation here, and we're thrilled to have so many of our students and faculty colleagues and Cambridge neighbors, and welcome to Dean Elmendorf, and a special welcome to those that are here attending the Democracy Entrepreneurship Conference. This is an exciting weekend that we begin here at the Kennedy School, and we are collaborating with the Ash Center and the Shorenstein Center, and so we are very much excited for the weekend ahead. We're bringing together academics and philanthropists and journalists and policymakers, all dedicated to improving our democratic institutions. So the beginning of what we all hope to be fruitful conversations, and we're delighted to have you here, and special welcome to Alan Casey, who's been our collaborator with that. So to engage in this forum, there could be no better guest than Senator Jeff Flake, who has served in the United States House of Representatives and Senate. His bio is before you, and I need not rehearse that to you. Other than to observe, he is now spending a lot of time over the course of his career, utilizing his perspective on working towards a greater common ground. So as we think about this weekend with our conference on strengthening democratic institutions, his conversation with Professor Leah Wright Rigueur will be one that will be a good kickoff to our convening and for all of us here. To moderate the conversation is Professor Leah Wright Rigueur from the Kennedy School, and she brings her perspective and scholarship to the conversation. So join me in welcoming Professor Rigueur and Senator Jeff Flake.
Right.
It's a bit intimidating.
I know. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the introduction, Mark, and thank you all for coming out on a Friday evening. But I promise you we will have a very good conversation, and there is a very good reason why you are here. With that, I have to say thank you, Senator Flake, for coming and joining us today in what must be a very busy, busy schedule on your part.
Hey, no, it's wonderful. Anytime you can come here, see old friends like Bill Dillahunt and new friends like Gary. I mean, this is the place to be. Really is.
Excitement. So also I should say thank you too to everyone for coming out and for being part of joining us in part of what is a really exciting conference, the Democracy Entrepreneurship Conference. And the theme of tonight's discussion is strengthening democratic institutions. Now, of course, as we get into the conversation, Senator Flake, I'd actually love to hear what that phrase means to you, right? It's a pretty distinct, strengthening democratic institutions, what that actually means. But I thought we'd start off by actually talking a little bit about your background and really thinking about one of the foundational aspects of democracy and the democratic process, and that's public service. So I would love it if you could tell us a little bit more about, why run for office? Why get involved in politics?
Well, I grew up on a cattle ranch in northern Arizona. I grew up in the town of Snowflake. That's not a joke. That's my great-great-grandfather was sent to Arizona by Brigham Young to colonize for the Mormon Church at that time. And he settled the valley, and then a man named Erastus Snow came along, and they called it Snowflake for the two of them. But I grew up with 10 brothers and sisters, and 69 first cousins on my father's side alone. That's how I got elected. But public service was ingrained. My father served as mayor of Snowflake. It kind of came by rotation, I think. But my uncle Jake Flake from Snowflake, Jake was Speaker of the House in Arizona, and he died about 10 years ago after being thrown from his horse, the last of the true Arizona cowboys. And so going into public service, I mean, I didn't grow up thinking I'm going to be a congressman, I'm going to run for office, but giving back appealed to me. And I have to say, growing up in a town of Snowflake, a small town like this, whether Republican or Democrat, it didn't matter that much. And in fact, the Mormon Church back in the late 1800s was concerned that there might be too many of one party in the church, and if a new administration came in, they might, it might not be good. And so they basically said one morning in church, those sitting on the left side are Democrats, those sitting on the right side. In Snowflake, it was those east of Main Street are Democrats, those west of Main Street are Republicans. That's how you should register. And that held for generations. And the Flakes were east of Main Street, so my father was a Democrat, and until late in life. But I saw, people just work problems out, not on a partisan basis, but you have to get things done if you're in a small town or if you're in local government, and that's what I tried to take to Washington, at least, that kind of ethos.
So tell us a little bit about that. Arriving, you're coming from Arizona, you show up in Washington, you show up in two different capacities over the course of time. I think everyone in our audience, particularly students in the audience, are always very curious about the nuts and bolts, how the sausage gets made, the policy behind the policy. So tell us what it was like in Washington.
Well, kind of the atmosphere, it used to be, there was a very well-known Arizona politician, Mo Udall, who ran for president as a Democrat. He was the first one to say, and it's been carried on by several Arizonans, that Arizona is the only place that mothers can't tell their children, someday you'll grow up to be president. So we have too many failed presidential candidates from the state. But Mo Udall wrote a book that I read. He wrote it in the 1960s called The Job of a Congressman. And I read it when I first got to Washington. And he talked about the office budget having enough money in it to travel home to Arizona 3 times a year. So when he was elected, and this was commonplace, anybody elected to the House or the Senate would move their family back to Washington and then live there, usually in the suburbs. Children of Republican senators and House members would go to school and play on sports teams with children of Democratic representatives. The families would socialize on the weekends, and the bonds that they formed on the weekends really kind of overwhelmed the partisanship during the weekdays. And that trend, went the other way. It's been drifting for the whole time, but it really accelerated in the 1990s, just before I came to Congress, when Newt Gingrich basically instructed freshman members of Congress, you stay home, you're going to need to campaign. And so now we have very much a commuter Congress where people come to Washington, arrive on a Monday or a Tuesday, and go home on a Thursday evening. And you just don't have the connection that you used to. So it's a different place in that way. So that's kind of the backdrop going. But I came in 2001, and Republicans controlled both chambers and the White House. It was a heady time at that time. We thought we could accomplish quite a bit, and I think we did some. And then 9/11 came and really kind of changed the makeup. But we saw just a lot of people point at the partisanship today and lay it all at the president's feet. I think he deserves some of the blame, certainly, but not all of it. It started, and it's been trending this way for a while.
Well, that's actually, you bring up a good point. You gave a speech, I think, that touched on this, and in fact, nearly every major news outlet called it the speech of 2017. And part of that speech was both giving an overview of what you saw as the state of politics, the disappointing state of politics today, but also what I think was unusual in an era of polarization and in really intense partisanship. You actually stepped out and criticized your own party, I think, which a lot of people were shocked about. And I don't think that it came from, anger, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but instead from a sense of really wanting something better. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. What was that like in the moment?
Well, I've served 12 years in the House, 6 terms, and then was in the middle of my first term in the Senate. I had always planned on doing probably 2 terms in the Senate. I thought that would be good. But the president, and I don't want to be partisan, but this is just my own view. When he ran for office, I had never been acquainted with him and never talked to him, but I was really bothered before he was a candidate by the birtherism. I just thought that was just very untoward to basically question the president's fitness for office. And I thought if he believes it, that's bad enough. If he doesn't believe it, but is playing on people who did believe it, that's even worse. And then the campaign with the statements about immigrants, and then about John McCain and whatnot. It was just too much for me. I'd hoped that he would change as president. I'd hoped that he would assume the office like others had and act differently, and he didn't. I thought the people of Arizona would appreciate somebody who actually stood up and said, I agree with the president sometimes. He's conservative sometimes. I try to be a conservative. But in the end, what it came down to is I just could not see myself standing on a campaign stage with the president while people were shouting, lock her up, and things like that I just couldn't take. I couldn't do it. And that's why, I can critique Democrats in office, certainly, but as a Republican, I feel it's more of my duty to call out what I think are policies that I don't believe are conservative, like the protectionist policies and some of the anti-immigrant things. And so I felt that it was my duty to do that at that point. And it's not a comfortable place to be in. And let me just say, where politics is today, and this is not all the president's fault. He's certainly at the top, and he sets the tone and could really help the situation. But for elected officials, every incentive now is to rush to your corner and stay there, to declare your position right at the beginning and don't move. Because if you indicate for a minute that you might be, that a hearing that you're chairing might inform your vote, or an investigation that might be occurring might persuade you. As soon as you do that, you are hit by both sides, and hard. And I've lived in that space for about 2 years, and it's not a comfortable place to be in. If for nothing else, the death threats that come from the right and the left. And it really, all the political incentives are driving us there, and it's not a good place, particularly in the Senate that's been known as the world's most deliberative body on any big issue, whether it's climate change or whether it's debt and deficit or whether it's Kavanaugh or whatever else, any big issue, the number of people who are actually deliberating or indicating that they might be open to deliberate is, they're fewer and fewer all the time, and we've got to get away from that. We really do.
So, this brings up a good point. This ideological, gulf right now seems so vast, and it seems like, outside of, say, differences with the executive office, that even if we go back a little bit, that there are significant differences between the two major political parties, even within the parties. But speaking about this kind of Democratic, Republican, left-right divide, is there room for kind of collaborative moments across the left-right divide?
Yeah, there are, and we saw a good example of it in December with criminal justice reform. That was a bright, shining moment, and that really had its origins, years ago in states like Texas in particular, where you had, a very diverse group of people come together, fiscal hawks who were tired of building new prisons, people concerned with social justice and disparate sentencing, people in the faith community who wanted to do more rehabilitation in prison and decrease recidivism. They all came together and said, let's do something. And that was so strong that Washington couldn't ignore it. And you had people in the administration and on both sides who came together. So it is possible. It's a lot less frequent. I was involved, fortunately, when I got to the Senate, the first thing I got involved with was the Gang of Eight, the immigration thing. McCain said, "Come on, Jeff, this will be fun." Yeah. It wasn't. He lied. No, but what it was, though, it was 7 months of, the way the Senate used to be. 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, every night. Every night we were in Washington for 7 months negotiating this package that we all agreed, we would protect from all amendments, foreign and domestic are all poison pill amendments, and you don't see that much anymore, and that used to be more the norm. I tell you how infrequent it is. Whenever Republicans and Democrats come together, it's called a gang, so like it's some kind of illicit activity. I thought I left gang activity behind after the mean streets of Snowflake, but it used to be more commonplace. Bill and I, Bill Delahunt here, when Bill is a progressive Democrat, I think you might say, and when I first got to the Senate, I thought, the Cuba policy we have is just wrong. As a Republican, how can we say that we preach the gospel of commerce and travel and trade and contact, but with Cuba we said no, not that way. And so I got a group of Republicans. Bill headed the Democratic side, and I think we had 32 members of the Cuba working group, and we were able to pass the legislation to lift the travel ban. We couldn't get the president to sign it at that time, but we worked on it, and now we do have diplomatic relations, and things like that can work, but it's far less frequent now. I was so troubled when I got to the Senate at the lack of bipartisanship. I had done this crazy thing a few years before where I marooned myself on a Pacific island. I just wanted to see if I could survive by myself. I love to read sailing adventures gone bad. It's my favorite genre. And I always wondered if I were marooned on a deserted island, could I survive? And finally my wife said, if that's your midlife crisis, get it over with. And so I marooned myself for a week and survived. This was back 10 years ago during a House recess. But then when I got to the Senate, people think I'm great. I'm not kidding here. But I got to the Senate, and Martin Heinrich, Democrat from New Mexico, we served in the Senate or the House. We were elected to the Senate together. I knew that he liked to spearfish. I thought this guy could be useful. But we wanted to prove that Republicans and Democrats can get along. And so we planned very quietly, didn't tell one of our colleagues, that we were going to maroon ourselves on an island for a week to prove that we could get along. And we did it. And before we left, I went to Discovery Channel and said, you guys do a lot of survival shows. We're going to have a GoPro camera we'll take with us, and if you want the footage, they said, no, we want to come film it. And so this was not Naked and Afraid, by the way. Afraid, yes, but anyway, they sent their camera crew, and for a week, Martin and I survived with basically just a machete between us. And we did it. You can still get it on Amazon for $3.99. I think Discovery still airs it every once in a while between episodes of Naked and Afraid. But they called it Rival Survival. And we got back and we went on a lot of the shows to talk about what we'd done. And Stephen Colbert ran a clip of us out there spearing fish. And he said, Flake and Heinrich proved once and for all Republicans and Democrats can get along when death is the only option. So for what it's worth, it's been empirically proven it can happen. But it really, when you have example or you have experiences, you just think, man, can we get much worse? And one came, when Gabby Giffords, my colleague from Arizona, was shot in January of 11, I believe. We left an empty seat for her at the State of the Union a few days later, and then a year later she came back, but only to resign the next day. So she came to the State of the Union, and I sat with her, and she wanted to stand up when President Obama gave his applause lines, and so she couldn't stand on her own, so I would help her up, which left me, a lone Republican, standing amidst the sea of Democrats. I literally got hundreds of emails and texts and calls saying, "What are you doing? Are you agreeing with President Obama?" And it just, it was unbelievable that people take any gesture like that as consorting with the enemy, because the other side is not just your political opponent these days, it's the enemy. And that's got to change. And then I was on that baseball field with, the morning when Republicans were shot at. And I just remember when somebody yelled, "Shooter, shooter." And I just turned to the dugout and ran. And as bullets were pitching off the gravel in front of me, I just remember thinking at that time, why us? Why? How could somebody look out at a bunch of middle-aged men playing baseball and see the enemy? And it just struck me. That's what, if anything, that morning, that's what stayed with me afterwards. And so politics is pretty toxic these days, and it's going to take all of us, from the president on down, to change this, because the with 24-hour media, which we've had for a while, but the addition of social media has really made it all that more combustible.
So in a couple of minutes, I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience, but I actually have a little bit of a two-part question to ask you. I want to come back a bit to this idea of strengthening democracy. One of the things that we talk about here at the Kennedy School, in particular the Ash Center and the IOP, is the idea of what makes a healthy democracy. And one of the indications of a healthy democracy is high levels of voter turnout,
right,
voter registration, and yet right now one of the things that we're seeing are really abysmal levels of voter turnout and voter registration, and complaints from voters that they don't feel included in the political process. And so I was wondering if you might talk a little bit about why you think that is, right? So these kind of low levels, low engagement with the political process. And then, first of all, if you agree, but what, if anything, can we actually do to make the political process much more inclusive and really accommodating?
Well, I think it's incumbent on both parties to value voter turnout and to want to turn out more people. I wish, as a Republican, certainly, that we could turn out more people during the primary process. I don't know that a state legislature at that level, we certainly have issues with certain legislative districts, very low turnout, and that's just not. It's not good for democracy as a whole if you don't have good participation. And I think that people look at Washington, look at our inability to even be able to budget so that we can fund the government, in some way other than a continuing resolution for a few months at a time. And they think, what difference does it make? Every once in a while, you'll see a certain district or state where you'll have higher turnout, and we saw that in some areas. And I think that, pendulums do swing. And if one side feels that they aren't being represented, if they're that philosophy, then you'll see swings in the House. You're certainly seeing that right now. But I mean, legislative gerrymandering is certainly culprit of a lot of it. In certain districts, certain states, you think, why in the world for a Republican in California to vote in the presidential cycle? They'll say, why bother? Democrats feel the same way probably in South Dakota. So I think that's a lot of it, but it doesn't explain the lack of turnout in the Senate and the House. And sometimes we just get complacent. I spent a year in the country of Namibia, 89 through 90, when they had their first election, coming out from under rule by South Africa. And it was such a wonderful thing to see. 98% voter turnout. Not compulsory, but people coming, walking for miles because they finally had their franchise. And you think, boy, we take a lot for granted here. And particularly among young people, you think of the 18 to 24 demographic. Anybody ought to be concerned about what's going on here. The failure of Washington to address things like our pension reform and programs that really aren't going to hold up unless we reform them. Climate change, other things. If there's not enough motivation to get young people out now, I don't know when there will be. So it's important, but I think it has to be both parties really pushing it.
Yeah. So that actually brings up, I think, an interesting point, which is how do we concretely address this? It's been interesting to see that in the past couple of weeks, even in the last couple of days, there have been several different bills that have been introduced around, say, voting rights protections or, return kind of to various parts of the Voting Rights Act. And I'm just wondering, is that something that we pursue legislatively? Is it something that we put in? And, this may be, in fact, one of those ideological differences, not necessarily in end goal, but in methodology, right? So do we make voting compulsory? Do we do away with the Electoral College? Do we, add in, say, the popular vote?
Right.
Do we put in very specific protections? And I'm not suggesting that, these are things, and they may very well be things, but how do we do this concretely in a way that actually moves the needle forward?
I like the system as we have it now. I like the Electoral College because it emphasizes federalism and emphasizes the system that we have, and I like it. I may argue with some of the results sometimes, but I like the system. But it's like I mentioned in the House, certainly gerrymandering has meant that there's just far too few House seats that are really competitive. I give a lot of tours in the House of Representatives when family come to town, and I'll always go to the House floor and I would point out, everybody would ask where was your seat, and they were always surprised to learn there's no assigned seating in the House. But I'd point out, that the appropriators usually would sit up here in the corner, Murtha's corner, and then the Hispanic caucus was here, and then this caucus there, and the blue dogs. I'd always point out there, the blue dog Democrats would sit near the center aisle because they wanted to be seen near the center. And when I got to Washington in January of 2001, that was a group of about 30 or 40 people. Now, 1 or 2 or 3 left. Chuck Todd will always pull up that graph that shows the crossover votes. And there's just far fewer people on either side willing to cross over. And a lot of that has to do with just the gerrymandered nature of the House. That the court does address periodically. It's difficult to get state legislatures because they become more partisan as well. Certain states have enacted, strictures to try to modify that. Arizona has, but still, whenever legislatures are in control of the process, then we see it end up political anyway. So. I do think that pendulums do swing, and sometimes with a vengeance, and that when it does go too far, if some party tries and is seen as trying to encourage people or to put things in place that keep people from voting, gratefully, people sniff that out, and I think it behooves both parties to try to bring out as many people to play the game of addition rather than subtraction. Certainly that's what I believe the Republican Party ought to do.
All right, so we are going to open it up to questions from the audience. We have 4 microphones, so we just ask that you make sure that you come up to a microphone. Just before I open it up to questions, just a few points. Please identify yourself. Make sure that you ask a brief, emphasis on brief, question. And last but not least, we ask that you not give a speech and, in fact, end your question with a question mark. So, with
They just
that,
turned on more of the lights. I'm seeing how many people are actually here.
Yeah, it's a great.
It's terrifying.
So we will start over here.
Hi, Senator. My name's Leah Gearan. I'm an MPP candidate here at the Kennedy School. I'm actually from Mesa, Arizona. Furthermore, I was the Distinguished Young Woman of Arizona for 2014, a program that you sponsored and a program that your wife and your daughter continue to mentor girls in today. Wow. You have had a history of supporting women's groups. You are surrounded by strong women, yet you threw support to leaders in our government that have had credible allegations of disrespect at best and assault at worst. What actions can you or will you take in order to regain the trust of women in our democracy, and what advice would you give to your former colleagues today?
Well, thank you. I'm not sure I would actually agree with your premise much. I do remember when there was one individual running for the Senate seat in Alabama that I felt was pretty hostile to women's rights, Roy Moore, the president and many of my colleagues were supporting. I actually wrote a campaign check to his Democratic opponent. And so I felt strongly enough that that ought to be done. So I've tried. I'm not perfect in anything as an elected official. And I certainly, during the Kavanaugh hearings in particular, it certainly was an eye-opener to me at how many people, women in particular, are affected. The calls I got from family members and others, people who came to see me in my office and in the elevator, it certainly drove home to me that we have a long way to go, and I think all of us, I certainly have a long way to go in that regard. And that's why I was insistent that we have a more fulsome process than some of my colleagues wanted there. And I think the country's better for the process, at least, that we had. So thank you. And thank you for being involved in that program. I'll tell my wife and daughter.
All right, right here.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator, for being here with us. My name is Dimas from the Kennedy School. And I was wondering when the results of Bob Mueller's investigation comes out, and if there are some incriminating elements inside the result of the investigation, what do you think will it take for your Republican colleagues in the Senate to follow your footsteps and stand up to the administration the way you bravely did?
Okay. Well, I certainly hope if the Mueller investigation, I'm not convinced that it will. I don't know what will come out of the investigation. All I know is Bob Mueller is a good man and has served the country well, and I think he's certainly been extremely disciplined and careful in his investigation, and so I'm looking forward to the results. If it does turn up behavior that is impeachable, then certainly the House will move forward, and I hope the Senate will follow up. If it doesn't, I hope that we can move on. Personally, I hope that we don't have to go through an impeachment process. I just hope we don't. I'm on record, and I'll say it again. I don't want the president to be reelected. But that wasn't meant to be an applause line. But I'm just saying I don't want to go through an impeachment process. I've been in too many countries and have lived in countries where the electorate comes to a point where they, instead of trying to say, we didn't do well in this election, we're going to retool our message, we're going to do better in the next one, they simply try to disqualify the other side. And I don't want to get in that cycle. And I fear if we go through an impeachment process that some feel is unwarranted, then we get more ingrained in that cycle, and that's not a good thing.
Right here.
Hi, my name's Kezia, and I'm a junior at the college. As today is the first day of Women's History Month, I wanted to take a moment to open this to both of you about the current state of women in the Republican Party. This past midterm election, we saw a historic number of women elected to Congress, but only a small percentage of them were Republican. What steps do you think the Republican Party can take to be more inclusive and welcoming to women in 2020 and the future?
Well, great. I'm doing my part. My replacement was a woman from Arizona. No, but I have to say, my great-grandfather, James Madison Flake, is his name. When he was in Snowflake, his wife died of an illness, leaving him with several children to raise. And I remember reading his journal saying, when she died, he said, "Once again, I must kiss the sod and face a cloudy future." I thought, boy, that's whenever I'm feeling down, I think of that kind of thing. But he thought so much of his wife that he and her struggles and what she'd been through, that he committed himself to the cause of women's suffrage. And he traveled around Arizona as far away as Colorado to promote in his last couple of decades women's suffrage. And I couldn't help but think that he would be extremely proud, as I was in January, to be there on the Senate floor when Arizona swore in its first female senator, and 1 minute later, its second female senator. So we're doing our part in Arizona. But I do hope as a Republican that we can do more of that. The numbers in the House among Republican women are down, and that's not good. Gratefully, on the Democratic side, it's more than 100 out of 435. That's progress. I hope it goes higher. And when I look at the state legislature in Arizona, and you look on city councils and school boards and whatnot, they're run and populated and by women who are showing what it means to actually work and compromise. I do think that women do better that way. They've shown that they know what it's like to govern. I don't know what that comes from, being, maybe more responsible for how families have to operate and to get things done. But women in particular, and I think I can give you specific examples of people in the Senate who are more inclined to reach across the aisle, female senators, and to work on issues in a bipartisan way. So it's healthy. I hope it continues. And I've done my part. Put it that way.
Senator, thank you for being here today. My name is Meena Venkataramanan, and I'm a sophomore at the college from Tucson in the great state of Arizona.
Great. Boy, that's a good percentage so far.
Yeah, we're pretty underrepresented out on the East Coast, but there are a few of us. So as you just mentioned, Kyrsten Sinema scored nearly a 3-point victory in the 2018 Senate election. So in the 2020 special election for the Senate, I wanted your thoughts on what you think Arizona's political trajectory is going to look like, given that Sinema not only won this year, but also two Democrats, one's Secretary of State and Superintendent of Public Instruction, who also both happen to be women. So given this increasing Latino vote and this seeming push towards the Democratic Party, what do you think the prospects are of Republican winning in 2020 and where the state's headed more broadly?
Wow. That's why I'm out of politics, so I don't have to comment on things like this. But no, I mean, it's no secret that I think that it's problematic. I mean, for myself, I felt good about my chances in a general election. I think I could have done okay in a general election, but I could have no more won a Republican primary in Arizona as a critic of the president than the man on the moon. Right now, this is the president's party. And in a state like Arizona, in this atmosphere, you've got to embrace the president. I think our candidate felt she had to do that to get through the Republican primary. and she lost. Arizona still has about a 200,000 vote registration advantage for Republicans. So if you have a superintendent of public instruction or state mine inspector or ones that typically don't get that much attention, just having an R behind your name, if nobody does any advertising or anything else, you'll win by 200,000 votes. And those in Arizona, by and large, who just ran as a traditional Republican, who avoided the president's campaign and the rallies, won statewide. Those who didn't, those who identified themselves with the president, those who used his rhetoric, who were seen on the campaign stage, lost. And I can only suspect that 2 years from now, that effect will be exaggerated if the president is on the ballot, because it will certainly drive out more people from Republicans who really are behind the president, but it will really drive out those on the other side. And so my advice would be, has been and will continue to be, understanding that it's a minefield out there to try to get through a Republican primary. If you're going to win a general election, you can't be identified with many of the president's policies, and you can't be seen condoning the type of language and politics and some of the behavior, or you will lose in Arizona and a lot of other states. I mean, the fact that we have no Republicans representing Orange County in Congress is unbelievable. Would have been unbelievable just a couple of years ago. I don't think that Republicans have received the message like we should have from the midterms, because we kept the Senate. The map was so favorable to Republicans. It was just difficult to lose, but boy, in the House, to lose 40 seats, and in certain states, Nevada, New Mexico, just every statewide office, Democrats, super majorities in some of the legislatures. So we haven't fully, I think, digested that message as Republicans, and so that would be my message. Thank you. Thanks for being. Any more Arizonans here? Can they come up? Oh my goodness! Okay. Wow, it must have been mandatory for you to be here.
Okay. All right, right here. Thank you. Not an Arizonan, but my name is Marcy Harris. I'm a former staffer and actually here with the Democracy Entrepreneurs Conference as co-founder of PopVox. I have a question based on recent events in the UK, where 8 members of the Labour Party left to form an independent bloc, and I think 2 members of the Conservative Party left. Granted, it's a very different system with its own problems right now, but since you were a member of so many gangs in the Senate, and those gangs have a lot of influence and can really move things, were there ever conversations about making those gangs a little bit more formal or exercising that influence in a more sustained way?
Yeah, I mean, in the Senate, given the rules of the Senate, I mean, the rules of the House protect the majority. The rules in the Senate protect the individual. And with 3 or 4 Republicans and 3 or 4 Democrats, if they come together now, or just about any time, the Senate rarely has more than, 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 person majority on either side, you could really change that place. You could create a completely different power structure. And that would be very healthy right now, in my view.
Especially after you've announced your retirement.
There are people there who could do that. There are people who've come in, who've just been elected, have a lot of gravitas and name ID that could, and I hope will. That would be healthy for us right now. We have concentrated far too much power in the leadership and taken away from the committees where bipartisan agreement used to happen a lot more frequently, and we've instilled far too much power in the leadership structure. So I would like to see it in terms of people running as independents. Some states have a tradition of that. It is coming, I think, if we continue the direction we're going. It is an inevitability, but but will still take a while, a few more cycles in some of these states, and maybe even longer than that at the presidential level.
Right here.
Hi, Senator Flake. Thank you so much for being here. My name's Remy, and I'm a junior at the college. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the Kavanaugh hearing that I think you touched on earlier. And I think you said, and I didn't write it down, so I won't quote you directly, but something to the effect of the country being better for the process that we saw happen with the Kavanaugh hearing. And I think the changes that we saw from Anita Hill to Kavanaugh, I tend to agree that the country is better for the process. And I think if we're talking about strengthening democratic institutions, certainly the confirmation process has been strengthened insofar as it is accommodating to survivors of sexual assault. But based on the way that the Republican Party in particular handled the confirmation hearings, and Kavanaugh himself with his partisanship and his divisiveness, I'm wondering to what extent you think the Republican Party was strengthened as a democratic institution that's accommodating of sexual assault survivors through the confirmation process, if at all.
I think the whole Me Too movement has been wonderful and has changed things more than the Kavanaugh hearing itself. That was I think the environment is better overall. I think a lot of Republicans feel, and if you go to a lot of states, there are people who felt there's a lot of sentiment, and I don't think Republicans handled it well. I would have liked to have seen an FBI investigation a lot sooner and a lot more thorough. That would have been my preference. And in the end, I just didn't buy my leadership's argument that we couldn't have it at all. And that's why I insisted on it at the end. But by the same token, the Republicans not handling this well, I don't think it was handled well by the Democrats either. Those allegations could have come out sooner and been handled in a more fulsome way where we all would have been better off, and I think better ends would have been served. And Republicans, the lesson that they took from that is it was overreach on the Democratic side. And I do think that the Kavanaugh hearings probably did bolster some Republicans' chances in some states in the Senate. It made it easier for Republicans to maintain the Senate. So the politics cut both ways. In the end, I mean, our whole confirmation process is just, we can look back at the Merrick Garland thing and how that was handled. It certainly wasn't unprecedented if you really read the history, but it wasn't good. And I think that we'll be worse off. We already are, I think, by the way we as Republicans handled the Merrick Garland thing, although you can point to it, and some will, with some justification, is that it bolstered Republicans' chances of winning in 2016. I would argue that those are short-term illusory gains for Republicans, and in the end won't benefit us. But it was a painful process. I can tell you, being in the middle of it. I wish, and I never want to get in the habit, and we shouldn't ever make background checks that the FBI does public. If we do, too few people will submit themselves to that process, and we need good people to serve as federal judges. But I wish the country could have read that report that was done. Like I said, I wish it would have been more thorough. I wish it would have been started earlier. But it was significant, and it was informative. And I wish the country could have read it. I think they would feel better, perhaps, about where the Senate landed in the end.
Thank you.
You bet.
All right, up here.
Hi, Senator Flake. Thanks so much for coming. Big fan. My name's Aaron Fogelson. I'm a senior at the college, and my question is, you just said earlier that you don't want the president to win re-election in 2020, and you're one of his most outspoken critics. Why haven't you announced a run for presidency in 2020? And if you don't run, would you endorse another candidate like former Massachusetts Governor Bill Weld, who's running against him?
Well, I've said many times that I do hope that a Republican does run. against the president. I think, if nothing else, to remind the country what it means to be conservative, remind Republicans what conservatism has traditionally meant, at least contemporary conservatism, and also what it means to be decent, and to bring that back, that kind of politics. But I've been doing this 18 years now, and it's time for the fever to cool a little. And I've asked a lot of my family over the past 18 years, and particularly my wife. And my wife even mentioned a couple of weeks ago, she said, "It's been 3 weeks and we've had no death threats." And that's something. I have to say, like I mentioned, that you just, if you're seen as, willing to weigh both sides or deliberate your hit from both sides in the space of a couple of weeks, particularly around the Kavanaugh thing, there were literally several. There is somebody serving time right now for threats made against my family. The person that dropped mailed the pipe bombs to several media outlets and individuals. When they got his hard drive afterwards, they found that he had a couple of Twitter handles, through one of which he put an aerial picture of my house, and said, "There are a lot of entrances. I'll see you soon." So you see things like that, and you think, yeah, we'll take a break for a while, at least. But this is the Republican Party right now. For anybody who's thinking of running, this is the president's party. I wish it weren't so, but it is. And if he wants to be nominated again, he may decide, hey, I've made America great in 4 years rather than the 8 I thought it would take. And he may decide, but if he wants the nomination, I think he's going to get it, unless Mueller report turns up, the Southern District of New York or something really comes to intervene. But when you look at the core base of support, he could probably drop down in popularity. He's now at 42 or 45. He could drop down under 30 and still have a sufficient base among Republicans to ensure his renomination. And so it's a tough ask to say to a Republican, get out there and do it. But I still hope some do. Like I said, it's good for the process, and there are names out there. John Kasich still talked about it, and Bill Weld is out there. There are some, Larry Hogan and others who have talked about it, and I'm certainly encouraging a lot of people.
Thank you.
But thank you.
Right here.
Hi, Senator. My name's Nick. I'm a freshman at the college. I wanted to ask you, looking back on your time in the Senate specifically, if you had both a moment that you're proudest of as a senator and maybe a biggest personal regret?
Personal regret first. This kind of takes in the House as well. And I mentioned in the book that I wrote, it's easy, particularly when you're in the House, to sometimes engage in what's called hope yes, vote no. When there's a big issue that comes along. And for me, it was the financial crisis that we faced in 2008. You had Hank Paulson and Bernanke come to the Capitol Hill and say, we're having a meltdown. We've got to pass this big package, which was ugly. Bailout, TARP. Nobody wanted to do that. And but we had to do it. But we had sufficient votes in the House the second time without my vote. And so I let my colleagues carry my water on that one. And I regret that. People often ask, what's your most memorable time in Congress? And I think without a doubt, I mentioned that Bill and I and others have been involved in the Cuba issue for quite a while, trying to I've always thought, if you want to get rid of the Castro brothers, just make them deal with spring break once or twice. let Americans travel down there. They wave the white flag pretty quickly. But I've always thought that we ought to just let Americans travel, exercise freedom, and it'd be good for Cubans. It'd certainly be good for Americans to see what it looks like there too. But Bill and I were able to pass legislation to lift the travel ban. We couldn't get President Bush to sign it, and then when President Obama came in, he would have signed it, but by then we couldn't pass it. And so, but we were still making progress, and the president could, by executive order, do some things legally, the good kind of executive order, undo previous executive orders, I should say, and allow, which he did, Cuban-American travel and remittances, which have really developed an entrepreneur class in Cuba that is making a difference, a huge impact. But we couldn't have diplomatic relations or move further as long as Cuba was holding a prisoner by the name of Alan Gross, who was a USAID contractor who had been caught by the Cubans and charged and convicted as a spy, and got a 20-some year sentence. And he'd been in prison for 5 years in a military prison in Havana, and I'd been down to see him, and we'd been trying to secure his release and couldn't. And he was in a bad way. He'd lost about 100 pounds and had told his captors, I won't spend another birthday in prison, I'll take myself out. And he was in a bad way. And so when I got home, I talked to the White House. I said, if you're not negotiating for his release, you better hurry. And they had been working on it. And a couple weeks later, they called and said, the White House called and said, can you undertake a sensitive mission? And I said, that's why I came to the Senate, this legislating, But they said, can you be at Andrews Air Force Base at 5 a.m., but you can't tell your wife or your staff where you're going. And then, so I showed up at Andrews Air Force Base with Pat Leahy, who was, we'd been working together on this issue for a while. And there was Alan Gross's wife, and Chris Van Hollen was there as well. He was Alan Gross's congressman. And we climbed on one of the president's planes and flew toward Cuba. Another plane took off. It was to pick up a Cuban national who had been a spy for us, who had been 20 years in a Cuban prison. And then another plane took off from Miami with 3 Cubans who had been convicted and were serving time in our prisons for being spies. So it was an old Cold War era spy swap. And we got to Cuba. We all 3 planes landed at separate airfields. Pat and I went in and got Alan Gross, and he was reunited with his wife, and we met briefly with the foreign minister, and then went out to the runway and waited for the signal. And exactly 31 minutes after we landed, we took off. And I'll never forget, and this is the moment that was the best. We were in the air for about 30 minutes, and the pilot came on and said, we've now entered U.S. airspace. And Alan Gross stood up and just shook his fists in the air and cheered, and then just breathed in and out several times. And he said, now I know I'm free. And it was just, it doesn't get better than that. As soon as we landed, President Obama in Washington and Raul Castro in Havana held simultaneous press conferences where they announced that we would have diplomatic relations. And then I was able to fly a couple months later with John Kerry down to help raise the flag over the U.S. Embassy for the first time in 54 years. And we had 3 Marines on our flight who were over 80 years old, who were the same Marines who had lowered the flag over the embassy. They wanted to be there when it was raised up. And so, moments like that, you can't beat it. That was incredible. And now Alan Gross, my wife and I were on a flight the other day to Dallas, and there was Alan and Judy on the same flight, just happened to be there, and he sends me a note every December 17th to commemorate that day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So I think we have time for 2 more questions, provided that they are quick. So we are going to start right here.
I'll try to make the answers a little shorter too.
G'day, Senator Flake. Peter Deutsch. Just got off a 40-hour flight from Australia. Glad to be here tonight. Question is, what makes bipartisanship hard? And when I'm asking this, I'm aware that you have incentives which make it difficult from the electoral college side, but what makes it hard for you as an individual from your own experience?
Well, the voters don't seem to value it right now. I mean, that's the biggest thing. In a Republican primary, that you being involved, for example, in the Gang of Eight, doing bipartisanship that way, that comes up in your opponent's campaign ads. So reaching across the aisle. One more experience with when Tim Kaine was chosen by Hillary Clinton to be a running mate. Tim and I have been working on an AUMF, or Authorization for Use of Military Force, and I really loved working with him. And anyway, there's an old saying, I should back up, that says, and it goes back to when members of Congress used to live in Washington with their families. They say, you'll never question your colleague's motives when you know the names of his children. And that's when you do. And Tim, his son Nat was a Marine, and he was patriotic and whatnot. But just to rib him a little, I tweeted out when he was selected as Hillary's running mate. I said, now I've got to count the ways I hate Tim Kaine, but I'm drawing a blank. He's a good man and a good friend. Congratulations. I got emails and tweets and whatever saying, how could you say that? How could you say that? And I was even at an event the next day in Washington, or in Arizona, at a Republican meeting, and somebody stood up and literally said something to this effect. He said, I saw that text or that tweet about Tim Kaine. You know that if you can't say anything bad, don't. And he kind of stopped, thinking, I'm just about to reverse every piece of advice my mother ever gave me. But that's the inclination right now. I can speak, maybe not for the whole country, but in a lot of Republican primaries, that if you work across the aisle or compromise, and Barry Goldwater, who's a hero of mine and is known for being a man of principle and extremism in defense of liberty is no vice kind of thing, he also said at one time, politics is nothing more than public business. Sometimes you make the best of a mixed bargain. And I think we'd do well to remember that part as well, that you've got to do it. But right now it's just not valued by the voters enough. That's what makes it difficult.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right. Last question. Let's make it a good one.
Oh no, it's the last question that I always get.
There's a lot of pressure.
Senator Flake, thank you so much for being here.
It's got to be a good question with a man in a Bernie shirt.
Fitting.
I wore it just for this. I read your book 2 years ago. I just want to say I really enjoyed reading that. My question was, though, given that we all agree that Trump is most likely to be the Republican nominee, and given that we're in a two-party system and it's going to be him versus a Democrat, would you say that you're thinking about or prepared to vote for a Democrat in 2020?
Oh, sure. No doubt. I mean, I'm not saying that because you have a Bernie shirt on, just to make clear. But yes, I've voted for Democrats before, and I will in the future, and that's what I think. The problem is these days, Republicans. Well, I thought that gratefully we saw the best examples with Roy Moore. I think he was a bridge too far, and you had enough Republicans say we just can't go there, and certainly there are some of those cases around, but I hope that we have a different Republican candidate, and we might have an independent. So I don't want to foreclose any option like that. But the notion that I'm Republican and therefore can't vote for a Democrat, I've never subscribed to that, and I hope nobody ever does.
Thank you.
So, thanks.
All right. So thank you so much. Just before we finish up, I want to thank you to our sponsors, so the Ash Center, the Shorenstein Center, and of course the Institute of Politics. And then of course a big thank you to Senator Flake for a fantastic evening. That concludes our event for the night. Thank you so much and have a good evening.